Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming to the Fisher tonight. My name is Lexi Johnson. I work as the curator at One Archives, the lead curator on this exhibition that is bringing us all here tonight, along with my assistant, Katsala Rivolo, in the audience. We also have a few thank yous from Maria back there, who's doing the programs for the Fisher and helped us set up for this evening. We're really delighted to have Tom Sapsford with us. Give tonight's talk, which is so appropriate given the whole exhibition that we have. For those who haven't had a chance to see it yet, the exhibition is Sci-Fi Magic Queer LA, Sexual Science and the Imagination, looks at both science fiction fandom and the occult and the influence and importance of those two spheres on early kind of queer organizing and movement. So I encourage you to check that out. I think the exhibition will be open for a little bit of time after the conclusion of the talk. Thanks to James here, who's sponsored us from religion department and also the classics. We really love these kind of cross departmental things that we can do. One archive, I should say as well, for those who are not familiar, is a large special collection here on campus. We are the largest LGBTQ+ archive in the country, if not the world. We are now, thank you. Yeah, very exciting. 55% of what you see on view in the exhibition is from our collection, 45% from loans from elsewhere. We are located on the northern edge of campus in an old fraternity building. We encourage you all to come stop by and visit. We have exhibitions in our space as well, and the whole archives are open for research to anyone. You don't need to be affiliated. Please come visit us and check it out. But this evening's talk is so appropriate. One of the films that Tom's going to talk about is playing on view in the exhibition, so you'll have a chance to see more of it if you haven't already. And then just maybe a few words about Tom. Tom is a professor at Boston College. He looks at performance, gender, sexuality in Greek and in ancient Greek and ancient Rome. He has one book out, and I believe this is part of your book to come, book number 2. Yeah. So we're really in for a treat here from Tom himself. I should say also, Tom is a very old friend of One Archives, so we're delighted to have him back. Some of the other folks who I work with in LA, he had said Tom was a delight to have before, and so we're glad to have him back in LA. He was at USC, and it's great to have him here. So maybe a round of applause to welcome him, and we'll have a few questions after his talk. So if you have something bubbling or burgeoning, write it down so you don't forget it. We will ask a few questions at the conclusion. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here tonight. Just before I begin, in case you do want to look at the film, it's directly the wall back there. So I encourage you. My screenshots are not going to do its lush, soul corrupting colors any justice. Anyway, so first off, my thanks to Bart Johnson and One Archive, as well as USC's departments both of religion, classics, for making my visit to the Fisher tonight possible. This evening's talk is going to look at 2 examples in which the rituals of Dionysus, the ancient Greek god of transformation, wine, theatre, and the irrational, are reworked by 2 figures from the gay underground in 20th century California. Okay, thanks. First, filmmaker and occultist Kenneth Anger, and second, activist, writer, and witch Arthur Evans. Filmmaker Kenneth Anger incorporates Dionysus into his theological and magical cosmos as a victim to be torn apart and consumed by a master magician in mid-century Hollywood in his 1954 film Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Evans, a philosophy PhD dropout from Columbia University, starts a gay neo-pagan group called the Faery Circle in the mid-70s from his apartment at the infamous junction of and Ashby Streets in San Francisco. The Faery Circle partake in drug-induced orgies in order to worship and connect with what Evans understands as the 2 primary gods of most ancient pagan traditions, a mother goddess and her horned companion, whom Evans sees incarnated respectively as the ancient Greek gods Dionysus, Bacchus, and Pan. We might read both Anger and Evans as queer figures, as indeed several scholars have done to date, and as I shall frame them similarly tonight. However, neither may have been so comfortable with that term. Evans certainly was adamant about identifying as gay and explicitly distanced himself from the more inclusive and questioning queer movement of the 1990s and later. Yet Anger and Evans's redeployments of Dionysian ritual worship certainly can be viewed as queering ancient Greek practices. Both make fundamental changes to Dionysus and his rites that would make them seem illogical, say, to a 5th century Athenian. Yet both Anger and Evans, though being keen students of ancient spiritual traditions, nevertheless adapt and willfully shape Dionysian law to their own ends. For Anger, this means increased personal power, perhaps. For Evans, the embrace of Dionysian worship offers a utopic return to an ancient form of nature living. Both figures, however, through their Dionysian recreations, also produce queer pleasure by the creation and celebration of non-normative, non-procreative erotic jouissance and queer kinship via the creation of non-biological but meaningful community based on common outsider or underground positionality. Moreover, in their Californian receptions of the orgies of Dionysus, both Anger and Evans partake in what Jose Esteban Munoz has called the process of disidentification, which he notably wrote, quote, scrambles and reconstructs the encoded messages, universalizing and exclusionary machinations, and recircuits its workings to account for, include, and empower minority identities and identifications. Before we look at both Anger and Evans' reconstructions of Dionysus' myth and ritual, it may be worth quickly sketching out the source that both reach back to in their various ways, Euripides' Bacchic. In Euripides' tragedy, Dionysus seeks vengeance on the city of Thebes and its ruling class for disrespecting him and his brides. Maddening the city's women and driving them up onto the surrounding mountains, Dionysus tricks King Pentheus into dressing up as one of the raving women and into spying on their mountain orgies. Mistaking Pentheus for a mountain lion, his own mother, Agave, and her sisters pounce on their victim and pull his body apart. It is only when they return to the city that the enchantment is lifted and Agave sees that she holds her son's ripped off head in her hands. The first figure whose work you can see here tonight at the marvelous Sci-Fi Magic Queer LA exhibition is filmmaker Kenneth Anger. Anger, a native of Los Angeles, grew up in and around the movie industry. Notably for us gathered on campus here tonight, as a young man, Anger sat in on classes at USC's Cinematic Arts Department alongside fellow budding gay independent filmmakers, Curtis Harrington, whose work you can see in the room behind you, and Gregory Markopoulos. Through meeting many of the other individuals present in the current exhibition, particularly Harrington, Anger developed a lifelong interest in the occult in general, and in particular, the life and work of Aleister Crowley, 1875 to 1947. Thelema, Crowley's magical system, draws from several cultural traditions, but notably incorporates elements of ancient Greek myth and ritual. Dionysus and his rite of sparagmos, the rending apart of a sacrificial victim, appear well thought of in Anger's masterpiece Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome from 1954. Pleasure Dome was based on a real-life costume party held in Malibu with the theme of Come as Your Own Madness by Renata Drux, who in the movie plays Lilith. Yet it also enacts a Crowleyan ritual in which the participants must dress as the various divinities they play, and thus acts as a form of theurgy, with its participants both summoning and embodying the divinities they appear as. The film, in all of its many versions, has its central character, played by Samson de Bria, awaken, be visited by a series of figures dressed as various deities: Astarte, Aphrodite, Ganymede, Hecate, Lilith, Isis, Kali. They all feast and celebrate, then the god, Pan or Bacchus, is poisoned and torn apart by the others. As the movie becomes more chaotic and less linear, we ultimately reach a visual climax with Cameron overlooking all from the flames of hell as the whore of Babylon. The wave of images finally settles in on De Bria, who beams content and empowered with incorporated and increased Godhead as he closes his hands in a gesture of triumphal completion. And while the ritual happening is sometimes described by Anger as a Eucharist, taking the Christian term, in an interview with film magazine Take One, the director also connects the film's pivotal moment with the central act in the ancient Greek worship of Dionysus, albeit using the god's more Roman name. He said, "This is the actual thing the film is based on, in which the gods and goddesses interact. And in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, it's the legend of Bacchus. That's the pivotal thing. And it ends with the god being torn to pieces by the Bacchus. This is the underlying thing." Thus, in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, as Anger above describes it, the god Pan or Bacchus is tricked into drinking poison and is subsequently dismembered and consumed, thus augmenting the central figure in Magus' powers. As mentioned earlier, Pleasure Dome visualizes the religious ideas and ceremonial practices of Aleister Crowley, the occultist, whose pagan revival both shocked mainstream Edwardian society and inspired, in many regards, the various neo-pagan movements of the 20th century that followed. As Richard Dyer describes it, Crowley's magic rituals involve vital forces, sometimes symbolized, sometimes embodied in gods and goddesses, the ultimate purpose being to put the ritualist in touch with the holy guardian angel, the aspirant's higher self. Dyer adds that Anger's films are structured according to magic ritual. Characters or the film itself invoke the magic spirits by various means, drugs, dressing up, the use of occult objects and words, and so on, and master them in transcendence, symbolized by gestures or images signifying wholeness and completion. This transcendence is also the realization of the higher self. Key to understanding Anger, I think, is the fundamental notion that the films are not just a recreation, documentation, or theatricalization of a magic ritual or practice, but also serve in themselves as a form of magic ritual, a sacred text captured in light and sound. They enchant us as we experience them, and as such are just as much devotional objects as they are works of art or entertainment. For the classicists here tonight, we might think of them as the celluloid equivalent of the Cletic hymn. Two specific aspects of this cinematic ritual grab my interest. First, why does Anger make Pan present at this sparagmos rather than, say, the proper Greek deity Dionysus? Second, why is it the god himself who is tricked and destroyed when typically the god or his acolytes, usually the all-female Maenads or Bacchants, rend apart a human sacrificial victim for an animal? The conflation of Pan with Dionysus made by Anger also occurs with Evans, our second case study, although their roots to this syncretism differ, as we shall see. In Anger's case, the connection between Pan and Dionysus or Bacchus can be tracked through the history of European occultism. Furthermore, it is through this occult history that Pan becomes such a homoerotic figure in Anger's mind. I want to point out now a direct link from Eliphas Levi, 1810 to 1875, through to Anger's preferred occultist and magical leader Crowley. Thus, it is via Levi that we get our image of Satan as a goat-footed creature through Levi's creation of Baphomet of Mendes, or Pantheos, who features in his 1854 work, Transcendental Magic, Its Doctrine and Ritual. Levi's goat deity is a conflation of the idol Baphomet, whom the Knights Templar were accused of worshipping, and Pan, in his Egyptian form, the goat of Mendes, as described by Herodotus in Book 2, Chapter 46. For Levi, this deity is symbolic for the pantheistic cosmos, representing the divinity of all things and all things contributing to the divine. As Paul Robichaud writes, Levi's image balances the absolute and the human and the animal, mind and body, male and female, all under the sign of divine revelation. Levi's satanic-looking Pan then flows into later occult magical tradition, and it is with Crowley that we get the conflation of Pan and Dionysus, and lurking behind them both, Crowley's central and most valued deity, Lucifer or Satan. For instance, it was one of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn's early members, Arthur Evans, who translates Levi's work into English, and it was to the Golden Dawn which Crowley belonged before breaking off and then taking over and transforming the rival occult society, Ordo Templi Orientis, furnishing it with his own magical system, thelema, and its own totalized belief. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Crowley further deepens the syncretism between these several horned deities with the creation of his own demonic persona, called the Great Beast or Master Therion, and associated with 666, the so-called number of the beast from the biblical book of Revelation. And indeed, in Inauguration to the Pleasure Dome, in the opening shots, as Anger's notes reveal, as Samson de Brea, as the Magus completes his toilette, leaning into a threefold mirror, we see him metamorphosized into the great beast with red and yellow flesh and claw-like hands and talons. Next, Cameron, playing Carly or the Scarlet Woman, is shown in close-up as she slowly unfolds her closed hand. Balanced upon it is a tiny figurine of Pan. When we eventually meet the actor playing Pan, he looks nothing like this. The great beast snatches the tiny figurine, which immediately transforms into flames, foreshadowing the destruction and consumption of Pan to come. Cameron then lights a joint from the beast's flaming hand as a large blue image of Crowley, turbaned and smoking a pipe, is superimposed over the scene. Alongside this notion of a malevolent or satanic Pan, it is with Crowley that we begin to get a highly homoerotic Pan, and a Pan further conflated with Dionysus. We can see the legacy of Crowley's homoeroticism both in the way that the film's protagonist, the effete and camply sinister de Brea, gazes longingly at his prey, the blonde, young, and fairly unadorned Paul Matheson, and also too in Anger's fixation with Matheson's face, boots, and naked torso, on which his lens also lingers hungrily. Crowley, described as historically ambisexual, was a notorious proponent of sex magic, the notion that the massive energy created through orgasm has magical power to manifest physical change in the world. He also advocated the consumption of sexual fluids produced in ritual sex activity as a form of Eucharist, of which we can see an obvious echoes in Anger's film Rite. And although the ritual in Pleasure Dome seems to center on a cannibalistic act, there is at the same time the sense that a darkly sexual magic underlies each and every frame of the film. However, back to Crowley and the homoeroticizing of Pan, we might add, is more often associated with the heterosexual rape of Syrians, say in ancient myth. In the early 1900s, Crowley was involved sexually with a poet called Victor Newburgh, then an undergrad at Trinity College, Cambridge. The two not only published poems in which they conceived of Pan as sexually penetrating each of them, but also they invoke the deity in their 1914 sex magic ritual known as the Paris Working, which was to prove the end of their relationship. Let's look now at a couple of particularly, quote, gay moments in their paired Pan poems before a suggestion of how the Paris Working directly influences the visual vocabulary of Anger's Pleasure Dome. Newburgh describes his moment of divine penetration by Pan in The Lost Shepherd from 1910. And he clasped me, slim and light, and I roared with the pain he gave, and he cried, I will hold thee here, climax all night, my beautiful dark-haired slave. In The Triumph of Pan, from the same poetry collection, Newburgh describes Pan's powers extending to the ability to make Newburgh a quote-unquote invert. Note how he uses two temporally loaded terms from turn-of-the-century sexology to describe both the male and female homoerotic identities that Pan might engender in his victims. Lastly, there is one great one, cold and burning, crafty and hot in lust, who would make me a sapphist or an Urning, a lesbian of the dust. Here, sexual inversion is presented as the gift of the great goat god. In a response poem composed in 1913 and later published in 1919, Crowley likewise imagines having intercourse with Pan, but in doing so gaining numinous powers himself, much as we see de Brea doing via his incorporation of Pan in the Pleasure Dome. I am Pan, your Pan, Pan. I am thy mate, I am thy man. Go to thy flock, I am gold, I am God. Flesh to thy bone, flower to thy rod. With hooves of steel I race to the rocks, through solstice stubborn to equinox. And I rave, and I rape, and I rip, and I rend, everlasting world without end. mannequin, maiden, Maenad, man, in the might of Pan, yo Pan, Pan, yo Pan. Notable here is Crowley's avowed homoerotic desire. I am thy mate, I am thy man. His becoming the god, with hooves of steel I race. His violent act of rending flesh, I rip, I rend, a precursor to Angus Hollywood's sparagmos. And last but not least, the specific association of Pan here with the Maenad, who in ancient Greece is more closely associated not with Pan, but with Dionysus. One last point before heading into the appearance and death of Pan in Angus Pleasure Dome. While not mapping onto the deities and ritual action of the film exactly, the Paris working, the sex magic ritual undertook by Crowley and Newberg, which in itself includes an invocation to Pan and instructions to dismember a victim for the gods, associates the divinities they summon with a set of specific and vivid colors. And I think we can see a visual spillover of this cosmic chromatism in the saturated hues of Anger's later film, which likewise uses particular colors to convey the numinous appearance of its diverse deities as they gather, banquet, sacrifice, and eat. Thus, on the 8th night of Crowley and Newberg's Paris sex rituals, the pair are given the following information, presumably by summoned spirits of Roman deities and the colors appropriate to each of them. Priapus, yellow and purple, Bacchus, scarlet and green, Venus, blue, white and gold, Minerva, white, blue, and a little dark blue, and Pan, crimson. When Pan or Bacchus appears in the pleasure dome, he is neither horned nor excessively hairy, like most visualizations of this stereoanthropomorphic deity. Instead, he is blonde, short-haired, smooth-cheeked, more in the mold, say, of a Californian surfer boy. Thus, Pan, Bacchus, Dionysus here shares more similarity to the blonde, hunky bikers of Scorpio Rising from 1963 and the albino wand bearer of Invocation to My Demon Brother of 1969 than, say, the Arcadian goat god is usually imagined. Yet, Anger visually identifies this deity through his common attribute, the grain. Thus, just before Pan's entrance in the film, Cameron in silhouette and in profile hands to Brea a full bunch of grapes. We then cut between Matheson's blonde, chiseled and blank face and those of the other celebrants, who are shown gazing at him with expressions of obvious desire. Matheson slowly crosses the space and Anger's lens closes tightly in on Matheson's leather boots. Yet in his guise as Bacchus, god of wine, Matheson also carries a bunch of grapes at his hips as he passes a reclining De Brea, one of whose testicles peeks cheekily through the bottom of his tunic, visually echoing, as Richard Dyer points out, the fruits in Matheson's hands. A short while later, Anger, playing the witch goddess Hecate, provides Curtis Harrington as the somnambulist with an amphora, from which Harrington will serve the assembled gods glittery ichor. De Brea empties poison from his ring with a flick of his wrist into Bacchus's cup, and Matheson, again stony-faced, imbibes. Next comes the film's climactic scene of sparagmos. Now what was once single, the camera frame, the face of the individual actor, becomes multiple as both Pan, Bacchus, Dionysus, and the visual plane is torn apart. As P. Adam Sidney describes it, quote, "At this point, the linear development of the film evaporates. The multiple superimpositions begin. There are no more dissolves. The pace changes from slow to varied. Bacchus is shown being attacked by both rending hands and by feathers, the latter seemingly playing the Crowleyan game of suggesting that any violence or dark magic we appear to be witnessing is simply make-believe, a campy form of dressing up, or indeed is it? For Anger with the pleasure dome and for Crowley in a life with a lifetime of occult practices, the aim of ritual actions is self-enlargement. The magus is glorified and his power increased by the act of sparagmos and the consumption of divinity, whether we think of this as the flesh of Pan in our film or of ejaculate in Crowley's sex magic rituals. Yet, in Euripides' Bacchic, a ritual source text for the film, things are quite different. The god himself orchestrates the deception of Theban women, driving them into a frenzy and tricking both them and King Pentheus, ruler of Thebes, into committing this violent act. The sparagmos in the ancient context thus serves as a form of punishment inflicted by the god Dionysus on a society of Thebes, which in banning his worship is shown as being too controlled. Anger scrambles and recodes this story. Now it is the god Bacchus who is sacrificed and consumed, in some becoming the punished rather than the punisher. The Bacchants, as we saw Anger name them directly, are no longer noble women of Thebes, but rather Anger's motley crew of decadent and effete Southern Californian occultists. Their ritual action strengthens their bonds as societal outsiders. So whereas in Euripides, the tragic action is a warning to include Bacchic worship in the Theban city or suffer the god's wrath, in the pleasure dome, the ritual action uses the suffering of one individual so as to maintain the power of a secret and separative community hidden in plain sight within the heart of Los Angeles. Leaving Southern California now, I want to pick up the thread of Dionysian worship in San Francisco in the 1970s by turning to the spiritual practices of Art Evans. Evans, unlike Anger, explicitly states the interest he has in Euripides' Bacchae, and indeed has his own translation of the play performed at the Valencia Rose Cabaret in 1984 and eventually published in 1988. So he's intimately familiar with its text. However, even before staging the tragedy, he and his friends enact its ritual actions out in public. However, unlike Anger's dark, self-absorbed and self-empowering ritual, Evans uses the rites of Dionysus as a means of connecting spiritually with his other gay brethren and forging a utopic community dedicated to peace, love, and nature worship. While not actually present at the Stonewall riots in 1969, the event prompted Evans, then a politically engaged PhD candidate in ancient philosophy at Columbia, to become heavily involved in the nascent gay rights movement. Evans initially joined the Gay Liberation Front before co-founding a splinter group, Gay Activists Alliance. He eventually quit his PhD and relocated to the West Coast, first in Seattle and then in San Francisco, where he started work on his first book, Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture, and began his first attempts at living the book's central thesis. In Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture, Evans argued that old nature cults of the Stone and Bronze Ages had worshipped a great mother goddess and her consort, a horned god, sometimes her lover, sometimes her son. These cults had been superseded but never completely replaced by newer patriarchal religions, i.e. first the Olympian pantheon ruled by Zeus, and then Christianity. Evans further concepts patriarchal conquest to his own modern-day America by conceiving that the industrial state continued the process begun by Christianity to include also the exploitation and destruction of indigenous peoples through colonization. He writes, everywhere the old nature cults are gone. The Celts are gone, conquered by Caesar. The peasants of Europe are gone, having been murdered, enslaved, or transformed into an urban proletariat. The Indians are gone, wiped out on the orders from the Pope and Washington. The third world has been going every day. They are all gone. And in their place has come the son of the city of God, that all-conquering Leviathan, the new industrial state. And that's how it happened that straight white males got control of our lives, in case you were wondering. But Evans' groups of gay men have continued to worship the earlier matriarchal nature cult across time, whether considered pagans during the early spread of Christianity or witches during the medieval or early modern periods, until they ultimately had been quashed by the church. Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture ends with the call for modern gay men to return to their earlier spiritual practices, communal gatherings involving sound, movement, and erotic contact, or as he calls it, magic, though crucially not the systemic magic with a K propounded by Crowley and Anger. If we are ever to overthrow the industrial patriarchy, I believe we must tap into deeper energies, energies that the ruling classes of Christianity and industrialism have always desperately tried to deny and repress. These are the energies of magic. Magic is inherently a collective activity, depending for its practice on group song, dance, sex, and ecstasy. Evans particularly associated the worship of the horned god, here in one of his Greek guises as Dionysus, with the development of improvisatory ritual that originally incorporated and then lost its sexual aspect. Historically, the worship of the horn god was responsible for the rise of theatre in Western civilization. So there has always been a connection between theatre and gay men. Dionysus was first worshipped in a ritual of masquerading, song, dance, and sex by a group of people called the chorus. Eventually, the religion and sexual aspects of the ritual were forgotten, and the ceremony became a play, enacting out a previously written script. It's no accident that the word tragedy comes from the ancient Greek tragoidia, meaning goat song. Embellishing upon Aristotle's comments in the Poetics that forms of drama, and not just tragedy, developed out of improvisatory groups, Evans notably adds sex into the mix. One imagines that he sees perhaps the processions of large phalloi associated with the ancient dramatic festivals as involving some form of actual sexual ritual actions. He also uses the commonly held etymology of tragoidia as derived from goat song to substantiate his larger thesis of the widespread worship in ancient pagan traditions of a god associated with horned beasts, in this case, goats. Evans puts his theory of reconnecting with nature culture into practice in two distinct ways. First, he attempted to live off-grid. Second, he formed what he called the Faery Circle, a group that enacted increasingly elaborate rituals together. Evans's attempt at living in a remote rural location was a short-lived experiment, forming the Weird Sisters partnership with his then lover, Jacob Schrader. Together, they purchased 40 acres of forest land in Washington state, which was renamed New Sodom. Evans and Schrader's experience on their plot is recorded in the first issues of RFD, a magazine for rural gays made up from reader contributions, and reveals the overwhelming amount of work required of two individuals to manage this project alone. Relocating back to San Francisco, Evans then established the Faery Circle at his apartment on the corner of Haight and Ashbury himself, obviously a location almost synonymous with the hippie and flower power movements of the late 60s. The first incarnation of this group was held in October 1975 and consisted of Evans and a number of other gay men who sat in a circle, held hands, and chanted in their attempt, quote, to recover a sense of our countercultural heritage, our common connectedness with nature, and the untapped aspects of our sexual power. As Evans describes in his second book, The God of Ecstasy, Sex Roles, and the Madness of Dionysus, the rituals became more complicated. One Halloween, Evans and a group of around 20 fairies traveled to a remote beach at San Gregorio about an hour south of San Francisco. Processing down the steep cliff to the beach with torches, the group lit a fire in the dank, foggy night and began their usual chanting. As Evans writes, quote, veils and robes floated in the winds while finger cymbals chimed softly. Our torches sparkled in the salty spray. Next, a series of invocations occurred. A celebrant named Loki called on the 4 cardinal directions, another on the great mother goddess, another on the horned god, whom Evans specifically associates with Dionysus in his account of the evening's events. Lastly, it being Halloween, or the old Celtic festival of Samhain, a celebration for the dead, the group invoked their gay ancestors, quote, to remember the great antiquity of gay traditions, and to memorialize those gays killed at the hands of Christians, Nazis, and other oppressors. Next followed a period of wild music making and fire leaping before the group formed a long line of kissing, hugging, fondling, and groping bodies. Evans describes this moment of group sex as being an experience of spiritual connection with Dionysus, the horned god. Quote, I felt as though the group as a whole had become a living entity, and he was the one I was having sex with. And all the participants were just so many appendages of that collective body. The ritual ends with its participants spent, the 4 directions again invoked, and the Faery Circle being closed. Reflecting on the ritual's significance, Evans states, quote, that it was an exercise in sexual and spiritual self-determination, an attempt to identify spiritual needs and to articulate them outside of the hackneyed Judeo-Christian tradition and with a sense of humor and subversiveness. While obviously incorporating other spiritual traditions, the Celtic festival Samhain, the Nordic name of the celebrant Loki, there are a number of elements in this self-created rite which come directly from Evans's reading of the Bacchic. For instance, the paired relation between a mother goddess and the horned one is articulated in the chorus's entrance in the Bacchae, where after having arrived on stage, the Bacchants specify that they come worshipping both Dionysus and the secret rites of Cybele, the Great Mother. In the same ode, Dionysus is specifically referred to as a horned god, Tauro Chiron Theon. The paradox likewise makes mentions of the Bacchus' unusual garb, horn skins and garlands of mountain foliage, and of the particularly percussive timbre of their worship of hand drums. The most pertinent parallel between ancient and modern ritual here, I think, though, is the idea of Dionysian worship engendering a form of boundary loss in which the individual becomes incorporated into a large group. This is the concept most starting put forth in the Bacchae through the rending apart of Pentheus via, again, the rite of sparagmos. More problematic in the parallel between Evans's modern ritual and those described by Euripides is the place of sexuality. For throughout the Bacchae, Pentheus continually misreads and misunderstands the women's worship of Dionysus as being inherently sexual. Indeed, he accuses them of using it as an excuse to partake in sexual licentiousness under the guise of religious duty. They set up full pictures in the center of their revels, and they slink off, some here, some there, into secluded spots, where they ply their services to men lying down. Though they allege that they are Maenad priestesses, they actually celebrate Aphrodite, not Bacchus. Evans, throughout his writings, understands, like Pentheus, the actual worship of the horned god as invariably involving some form of sexual activity as part of its rites, just as the line of groping fucking bodies on the beach in San Gregorio demonstrates. As I hope you've seen tonight, while Evans and Anger both adapt the central rite of Dionysian worship, the sparagmos, they do so in some strikingly different ways. Evans aims to build community and provide a means for communal empowerment, using the sparagmos as a way of losing himself within the larger body of the group, wherein community can be forged and social progress be attained through sexual liberation. And indeed, that will be the legacy of these early experiments, when in 1979, Don Kilhefner, Mitch Walker, and Harry Hay hold the first Radical Fairy gathering in 1979 in Arizona. Hay, notably, was not only just the founder of Mattachine, the first homophile society in the US, but as the exhibition here brings to light, was also involved in Crowleyism, acting as a part-time organist for Gnostic masses at the Agape Lodge. And furthermore, as Ben Miller notes, Hay even includes a verse of Crowley's in the flyer advertising for the first three-day gathering of the Radical Fairies. This event, borrowing much from Evans and his earlier Faery Circle, was the catalyst for the still thriving queer spiritual tradition, the Rad Fae movement, that centers around several rural sites of sanctuary across the US and beyond. Anger, in contrast, imagines the destruction of a god and his ingestion as a form of Eucharist in order for the gaining of personal power. To put it in Crowley's words from the 1929 work, Magic in Theory and Practice, the magician becomes filled with God, fed upon God, intoxicated with God. Ultimately, the change will be complete. God manifests in the flesh will be his name. Anger's sparagmos, moreover, is an act of occlusion. It coheres a secret sect, and it purposely hides its meaning and its magic. The ritual rending and ingestion of Pan serves as code for the culmination of Crowley's Gnostic Mass, the consumption of sexual fluids. The audience for inauguration of the Pleasure Dome is limited until the later popularity of Scorpio Rising and the larger occulture movement of the late 1960s. Rather, inauguration of the Pleasure Dome seeks to speak to the insider and spiritual outcast, and in doing so, keep its tight-knit community hidden and safe. Indeed, summing up quite similarly the social position of lesbians and gays at the time of the film's creation in the wake of the Lavender Scare, the government's purge of federal workers beginning from 1950. Both Anger and Evans's modern reinterpretations of Dionysian rites also makes them decidedly homoerotic, whether in the predatory violence committed against blonde Pan by Dogria and his acolytes, or in the outdoor gay group sex engaged in by Faery Circle. Moreover, what was in antiquity described as a woman's ritual, and one which men could only view at their peril, becomes for both Evans and Anger a way of making erotic bonds between men. As already discussed, the sexual element is completely absent in ancient evidence of Dionysian ritual worship. Indeed, it is sex-obsessed Pentheus who believes that the worship of this god is simply an excuse for the women to escape to the mountainside and satisfy their carnal urges. Yet, sexual desire and the psychic and social power that comes from its fulfillment is absolutely common to both Anger and Evans's Dionysian receptions. Yet, as modern readers of Euripides' play, we can also detect a homoerotic undercurrent in the fascination felt by Pentheus towards his strange, beguilingly attractive and androgynous cousin Dionysus, the resonance famously picked up on in Richard Schechter's Dionysus in 69. Furthermore, both figures use their Dionysian rituals to explore the idea of gender fluidity, a topic frequently contiguous to and entangled with queer sexuality. And again, they do this in quite starkly different ways. For Evans, fairy culture allows space for exploring male femininity. For instance, the expression and embrace of the divine feminine element is present in the beachside ritual through an invocation to the mother goddess at the ritual's start, given as Evans writes, quote, to open ourselves to the power of the feminine in ourselves and in the cosmos. Second, Evans points out that this awareness is augmented through the various use of drag, saying to further this goal, many circle members wore dresses. Thus, Dionysus for Evans and for later fairies in many regards is proof positive of the essential divinity of androgyny in general and of male femininity in particular. Pentheus remarks upon this same characteristic when first meeting Dionysus as a stranger, noting his shapely form, so amorphos, long locks, platonos tanaos, and his pale skin, leukain. In ancient Greece, always a sign of the feminine. And we might know too that Dionysus is commonly portrayed as displaying feminine qualities in a male body in ancient Greek iconography. Anger's use of gender blurring, unsurprisingly, has its roots in Crowleyism. Both the figure of Debria as Shiva and Cameron as Kali confuse gender boundaries. Shiva, the embodiment of male femininity, and Kali, masculine femininity. Thus, each in their own way connect with Levy's image of Baphomet, the goat deity that combines male and female humanity in his all-encompassing figure. As Judith Noble writes in her essay to accompany tonight's exhibition, quote, Anger was foremost among the generation of queer occultists who succeeded Crowley and whose aim was to balance male and female aspects of the psyche and transcend gender entirely. This notion of a divinity beyond gender, reached through deviant non-normative desire, in the end, I think is the powerful result that Anger's dark magic ultimately offers us. Thus, it pushes us past the radical drag of Evans's fairies to a place where the gender hierarchy is completely subsumed within a larger queer godhead. Yet both disidentifications of Dionysus and his rites, to return to Munoz finally, reinscribe the original purpose of tonight's source text, namely to worship this non-normative god's divinity and to make his myth and numinous presence queer to us anew. In tearing out the sparagmos from the Euripidean text of the Bacchic, a work formerly translated, printed, bound, and sold, Anger and Evans re-sanctify the text in their adaptations, freeing it from the page. Evans leads Dionysus's worshippers into the wild, a northern Californian beach where they commune with the god and each other. Anger makes a textual reworking that emanates out of the geographical part of Los Angeles, albeit from one of the shadiest corners of Hollywood, sculpting a divine object in sound, light, and awe-striking color. Both individuals do this to engender spiritual and psychic transformation, just as participants, whether poet, performer, or spectator, at the ancient Athenian city Dionysia did, namely to show their due reverence for this queer trickster god and to experience in their own respective contemporary moment his wondrous power of ecstatic transformation.